Welcome to a story that blends mystery, terror, and a relentless battle against forces beyond human comprehension. In 1883, Chicago was the scene of a series of mysterious disappearances that led a former police officer and a courageous reporter on a dark and eventful journey. But will they be able to confront the evil that plagues the city? If you love mystery and suspense stories, don't miss any updates. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications to follow our upcoming stories. Get ready, because what's coming next might be even scarier. In Chicago in 1883, the city seethed with industrial chaos, the rise of new technologies, and political tension. The streets were narrow and crowded, the sounds of horses' hooves echoed around every corner, and the smell of factory smoke mingled with the aroma of food in the stalls. But beneath all this turmoil, a shadow spread silently through those dark alleys and ruins of old buildings. In the first days of September, the city was shaken by a disappearance. A boy of only 9 years old, named Daniel Hart. Daniel simply disappeared while returning from school. The story seemed trivial at first, a common disappearance among children. However, as the days passed, something strange was revealed. There were no traces, no sign, not even the smell of fear that usually accompanies these cases. The police, experienced in solving this type of occurrence, were unable to find any clue. No witnesses saw him. The only thing that remained was a vague clue, a whisper that haunted the city, a shadowy figure watching from the shadows, always near the site of Daniel's disappearance. The mystery was taking on increasingly disturbing dimensions. However, the residents of Chicago soon realized something that the police had not yet understood. That disappearance seemed to be only the beginning. A sinister, invisible, and relentless force was moving through the city. As the days passed, a climate of terror spread, causing more and more children to disappear, one after another, in different neighborhoods of the city. And as more children vanished, a question seemed to hang in the air: who or what was behind these disappearances? What do you think could be behind the children's disappearances? Could it be a supernatural force or something darker lurking in the city? Chicago, 1883, was a city in transition. Modernity was taking shape in its grimy streets, with the first signs of electricity illuminating the avenues, while the Industrial Revolution caused workers to crowd into packed factories. But beneath the facade of prosperity, the city was also a place of shadows, where the alleys and outlying areas held mysteries that few dared to investigate. Detective Thomas Callahan, he was a simple, pragmatic man. In his 40s, he was already accustomed to the crime and violence of Chicago, but there was something about this case that deeply disturbed him. Callahan was determined to find out what happened to the children, although at the same time he had his own doubts. The clues were scarce, and the case, with its unsettling twists, seemed more like a nightmare than a typical investigation. Callahan had a reputation for being stubborn, but he also knew that no matter how hard he tried, there was something beyond his control. When he looked at the first missing child, Daniel Hart, his face still immortalized in the yellowed photograph that hung on his living room wall, something tightened in his chest. He had lost his own son a few years earlier, and the pain still haunted him. The idea of another child suffering the same fate as his son was a burden he couldn't shake. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the city, Elizabeth "Lizzie" Moore Lizzie, a young journalist, was on standby. She was new to Chicago, but her curiosity and daring wouldn't leave her alone. Lizzie came from a small town in the countryside, and the disappearance of Daniel Hart had been the first major case she'd covered as a reporter. She didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural stories, but she knew something was very wrong. Like any good reporter, she was willing to follow any lead, no matter how strange or irrational. She had already heard rumors about shadowy figures seen on cold September nights near the neighborhoods where the children had disappeared. Some witnesses spoke of a hooded figure moving swiftly through the deserted streets, others of inexplicable sounds that seemed to come from the walls of abandoned houses. Lizzie, A skeptic, remained skeptical, but she knew something wasn't right. Lizzie began to follow Callahan's lead, disguising herself as a simple observer of the investigation. She knew he wouldn't believe her intuition, but her information could be vital to uncovering what was really happening. Something or someone was acting behind it all, and she had a feeling the answer was closer than anyone imagined. The city of Chicago seemed like a metaphor for what was happening to the children. On the outside, it appeared prosperous and progressive, but deep down, a dark and invisible force was spreading, taking over the city, like the evil that seemed to expand through the heart of the neighborhoods. As Callahan and Lizzie drew ever closer to the truth, another question began to emerge. A sinister question hung over everyone. What if the children's disappearance wasn't the work of a common criminal? What if there was something more, something beyond human comprehension, behind it all? Do you think the force behind the disappearances is human or something supernatural? How could Callahan and Lizzie uncover the truth? Thomas Callahan and Lizzie Moore's investigation was far from simple. With each new clue that emerged, the case became more tangled and mysterious. The police seemed directionless, and Lizzie, with her inquisitive nature, was not willing to remain merely on the sidelines. Both were aware that Daniel Hart's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather the starting point for something much darker. During one of his investigations, Callahan found an old diary belonging to Daniel Hart's father. The diary was filled with entries that, at first glance, seemed harmless. Notes about the family's daily life, concerns about their son's well-being, and even the financial difficulties the man faced. But one entry in particular caught the detective's attention. Every night, my son's behavior becomes stranger. He says he hears voices. The same voices I heard as a child. He says the hooded man is coming. Callahan felt a chill. The hooded man was one of the figures that appeared in the witnesses' accounts, but until now, no one had taken it seriously. Now, the diary was suggesting that Daniel had some connection to this mysterious being, as if he were destined to be the next victim. But what exactly were these voices? While Callahan was immersed in the mystery, Lizzie began to piece together an even darker story. She had visited the neighborhoods most affected by the disappearances and spoken with the residents. An elderly woman with glazed eyes and a trembling voice recounted something peculiar. That street, Blackthorn Street. They say it was built over a cemetery. Children have been disappearing there for as long as I can remember. They never come back. And the hooded man, he comes from the shadows. Blackthorn Street was increasingly becoming the focus of the investigation. Lizzie and Callahan, without knowing each other, were both heading in the same direction, unaware of what awaited them. One night, Callahan decided to walk to Blackthorn Street alone. The atmosphere was heavy, stifling, and the city seemed too quiet, as if the very air was suspended, waiting for something to happen. The street was deserted, its houses old and dilapidated, with broken windows and doors that creaked in the wind. Everything seemed abandoned, as if time had stopped there. Suddenly, something unusual happened. Callahan heard heavy, slow footsteps behind him. When he turned around, he saw no one, but the feeling of being watched was there. The detective continued forward, more alert than ever, until he reached an old building at the end of the street. It was an imposing structure, but one that now seemed dilapidated. Inside, the walls were marked with strange symbols, made of something that looked like dried blood. The marks formed patterns, as if trying to tell a story that no one else could understand. The instant Callahan approached, a hooded figure appeared before him, emerging from the shadows. The detective felt a wave of dread wash over him, but he remained composed. The figure didn't say a word, it just stared at him with empty, lifeless eyes. It was then that Callahan heard the voice of the missing boy, Daniel, echoing off the walls. "He is coming for all of us. He came for me, and he will come for everyone." Callahan didn't have time to react. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and a feeling of a macabre presence completely enveloped him. He ran into the street, his mind clouded, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Lizzie was in a local library investigating old city records. She found something even more disturbing. An old book spoke of an occult cult that existed in 19th century Chicago, known as the Children of the Night. This cult had rituals to summon beings from beyond and apparently used children as part of its rituals. The cult had been dismantled by the local police, but the book suggested that its followers never completely disappeared. They were waiting for a new leader, someone who would be able to bring the horrors back. The connection between the disappearances and the occult cult began to make sense. If the cult had truly resurfaced, perhaps the hooded figure was more than just a criminal. He could be a leader of this cult, and the children were being chosen for some dark purpose. Callahan and Lizzie, now with their investigations converging, began to understand that Daniel Hart's disappearance was only the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying. What do you think is behind the occult cult and this hooded figure? Did they really bring something from beyond? Or is there a more terrifying explanation behind it all? As Callahan and Lizzie delved deeper into the case, their investigations began to intertwine in unexpected ways, bringing to light not only supernatural mysteries, but also personal issues and moral dilemmas that threatened to destabilize their own realities. Callahan, despite his firmness as a detective, couldn't escape being consumed by the weight of his own losses. The memory of his son, lost years before, still haunted him, and Daniel Hart's disappearance brought back all the unhealed wounds. He saw himself in the missing boy's face, and with each clue he followed, the obsession with finding answers grew stronger. But as the investigation progressed, he found himself caught between his mission of justice and the need to confront the pain of his own past. On a cold night, while walking alone through the deserted streets after yet another frustrating meeting with the authorities, Callahan came across a familiar figure. Maria, the wife of her former partner, who had died in a work accident some years before, was a sad-eyed woman with measured words. She seemed to be searching for something. But what had brought her there? "You're after him too, aren't you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Callahan knew she was referring to the hooded figure, the evil that seemed to loom over the city. Maria was torn between grieving the loss of her husband and searching for answers. She knew more than she let on, but the words didn't come easily. "We can't go on like this," she said, her gaze vacant. "What you're hunting now is bigger than both of us." Callahan didn't know what to answer. He wanted to believe he could control the situation, that he could find what was behind the disappearances. But Maria seemed to know that, by digging deeper, he was losing himself more and more in his own suffering. She disappeared into the shadows before she could say anything more. Meanwhile, Lizzie was beginning to understand that the truth was closer than she imagined, but fear was also beginning to grow within her. She had approached the cult itself, disguised as a young student interested in learning about the ancient traditions of Chicago. One of the figures she had encountered was Samuel Willard, a strange man who seemed to have a peculiar interest in the history of the cult of the Children of the Night. He was an academic, but his questions and his obsession with the occult seemed excessive, even dangerous. Lizzie, cleverly disguised, struck up a conversation with Willard in an abandoned cafe. He was willing to talk, but the conversation quickly took an unexpected turn. "You're too close, my dear," Willard said in a soft but menacing tone. "The cult never disappeared. They're just waiting. And you seem to be becoming one of us." Lizzie felt a chill when she heard those words. She had discovered the secret, but now it seemed she was being pulled into an invisible web of power and fear, from which she might no longer be able to escape. Upon returning to her small home in downtown Chicago, Lizzie found something unsettling. Someone had left a note on her door. The words were written in hurried handwriting. "They're coming for you too." The game was getting dangerous. Lizzie realized she wasn't just trying to uncover the truth about the children's disappearances. She herself was being hunted somehow. The cult, or whatever was behind it, knew about her investigation, and now she was becoming a target. But Lizzie wasn't willing to give up. She felt the truth was within her grasp, and that kept her going, even as the stakes increased with each passing moment. On the other hand, Callahan, as he explored the city's outskirts and his own emotions, began to realize that something bigger was at stake. The children were not just victims, but parts of a larger plan, a network that wasn't just made up of common criminals, but of forces that transcended logic and human understanding. The markings found on the walls of Blackthorn Street were not just random symbols. They were a map, a guide to something much deeper and more dangerous. Tension was mounting. Callahan and Lizzie were getting closer to the truth, but with each step, the danger became more real, more immediate. The city of Chicago seemed poised to explode, and the two were at the center of it all, drawn into a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple disappearance. But meanwhile, one question remained. Who or what was behind all of this, and how could they stop what was about to happen? Do you think Callahan and Lizzie will be able to uncover the cult's secret without falling into their hands? What does Samuel Willard know, and how is he involved in the plot? It was a cold October night when the turning point finally arrived. Chicago was shrouded in a thick fog, its streets lit only by dim gaslights, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the city. Callahan and Lizzie, now aware that they were facing something far bigger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined, finally found themselves on the same track. But what they didn't know was that the cult, or whatever it was ready to make its final move, and the pieces were moving without them fully understanding the situation. Callahan, with his usual obsession, had decided to confront Samuel Willard directly. But when he arrived at the library where the academic was hiding, he found something completely different. The door was ajar, and the atmosphere was strangely silent. When he entered, what he saw left him paralyzed. Willard was standing with a blank stare before a large table where hundreds of photos of missing children were scattered. In the center, a photo of Daniel Hart with a mysterious symbol drawn in red. Willard, noticing her presence, turned slowly. His eyes were dull, as if something inside him had been extinguished. "You're too late," Willard said, his voice hoarse and emotionless. "The game has already begun, and there's no stopping it now." Before Callahan could react, the sound of something moving behind him made him turn around. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. However, the feeling of a presence stronger than anything he had ever felt enveloped him. That's when the ground opened up. In an impossible way, the room beneath his feet tore open, revealing a staircase leading to a dark and cold underground space. Before he could understand what was happening, Callahan was pulled by an invisible force into that hole, as if the very air were trying to swallow him. He fell, immersed in darkness, and, for a moment, lost consciousness. Meanwhile, Lizzie, for her part, had followed the trail to an old, abandoned theater located on the outskirts of the city. Everything pointed to that place, the final stage of the investigation. But upon entering, the set was empty, except for a strange chair in the center of the stage. As she approached, she noticed something carved into the wood of the chair. They were the same markings seen on Blackthorn Street. She turned to leave, but before she could, a hooded figure appeared before her. It was a surreal sight, a shadow in the darkness. The being watched her, motionless, as if waiting for something. "You're where you shouldn't be," the figure said, its voice low and menacing. "Now that you've found the place, it's too late to turn back." Lizzie felt a wave of panic, but before she could react, the man made a swift movement and a thick fog began to envelop the theater. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, and Lizzie realized she was in immediate danger. However, Something within her awakened, a sense of courage and determination. She wasn't going to give up now. She needed to understand what was happening. Suddenly, the air in the room trembled. The stage curtains rose on their own, and the theater lights began to flicker. Something was about to happen. The hooded figure moved swiftly toward her, but Lizzie barely managed to dodge and escape through the backstage door. She didn't know how, but her survival instinct had guided her, allowing her to escape whatever that being was. As she ran through the dark streets, what Lizzie didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. The true nature of the cult and its connection to the children's disappearance was about to be revealed in a more horrific way than she could have imagined. The fate of Chicago was about to be sealed, and suddenly the ground gave way beneath her feet. Lizzie fell into the depths of the underworld, unwittingly finding herself in the same place where Callahan had been taken. What do you think awaits Callahan and Lizzie in the underworld? Will they be able to survive and uncover the truth behind this sinister cult? Callahan and Lizzie were now trapped in a nightmare unfolding beneath Chicago, a labyrinth of darkness and mystery. They had both fallen into a shadowy underworld, a space devoid of meaning. The floor was made of a viscous substance, as if in constant motion. The walls were covered in ancient inscriptions, almost as if etched by hands not of this world. A cold, oppressive aura permeated every square meter of this place, as if the environment itself were alive, watching their every move. Callahan, still dazed from the fall, managed to slowly stand up. His body ached, but he knew he couldn't waste any time. The place where he was didn't seem human. The absence of sound was unsettling, as if even the air itself had been silenced. He knew that something or someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to act. Lizzie, on the other hand, was in a state of shock. She crawled to a wall, trying to process what was happening. It wasn't just the fear of the darkness or of what surrounded them. It was the growing terror of understanding that the cult, or the force that directed it, had manipulated her every move from the beginning. She should never have gotten this far. However, a part of her knew there was no turning back. She was too close to the truth. The two met in the center of that underground labyrinth, but something was different now. They were no longer alone. At the bottom of the tunnel, a figure appeared, once again hooded, but this time with an aura of authority. Its eyes shone with a supernatural intensity, as if the entire city of Chicago were reflected in them. The presence of this figure was overwhelming, as if the very space around them were distorted. "Welcome to the end of the road," said the figure, its voice low and resonant. "You've come this far, but now the truth will be revealed." Callahan, his detective instinct still sharp, stepped forward. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The figure chuckled softly, a laugh devoid of joy. "I am nobody important. I am merely the guardian of what you should never have discovered. But now that you are here, you will understand why the children disappeared and what truly lies behind the disappearances." Before Callahan or Lizzie could react, the figure reached out, and a ghostly light began to materialize before them, like a holographic screen. The images that emerged were even more terrifying than anything they had ever witnessed. They depicted children, but these weren't simple disappearances. The images were old, dating back many years, showing children being taken by members of the Children of the Night cult in macabre rituals. The children weren't sacrificed, but rather transformed. The cult used their bodies and souls to open portals between worlds, to bring dark entities from another dimension. The disappearance of Daniel Hart and the other children wasn't random. They were chosen, not just for their age or vulnerabilities, but because they possessed something within them, something the cult desired, a connection to the beyond, a key to forbidden power. What you have seen, these shadowy figures, are merely messengers, and I am the last of many, the successor of the one who began this cycle of terror, the figure said, revealing its identity, an identity that shattered all of Callahan and Lizzie's perceptions of reality. "I am Richard Drayton, the last leader of the Children of the Night." The revelation made the ground tremble beneath their feet. Callahan and Lizzie were face to face with the true culprit behind the series of disappearances that had plagued the city. And now they understood that somehow the cult was about to complete its ultimate goal, to bring something from beyond, something capable of plunging Chicago into utter darkness. Lizzie, her eyes wide, took a deep breath. But why the children? Why this damned cult? Drayton smiled, and his smile was cold, inhuman. Children are the key to opening the doors between worlds. Their death, their transformation, fuels the portals. Soon, Chicago, all of America, the world, will be under the control of the entities that await on the other side. Callahan felt a chill run down his spine. Everything he had investigated up to that point, all the clues, all the disappearances, all the deaths, made sense now. What lay behind it all wasn't just a cult's revenge, but a preparation for an apocalyptic event. But before he could say anything more, a wave of dark energy swept through the area. Callahan and Lizzie were thrown backward, and when they awoke, they were alone in an unknown location. What would happen to them now? The mission they had both begun, solving the disappearance of a child, had turned into a battle for survival, a battle that would decide everyone's fate. What do you think will happen now to Callahan and Lizzie? Will they be able to stop what Drayton and the cult are planning? What seemed to be the end of their journey, a twist of fate, turned out to be the starting point for a new kind of fight for Callahan and Lizzie. The Chicago underworld, where the Children of the Night cult was hiding, was no longer just a setting for investigations or mysteries. Now, it was the battlefield where their lives and the lives of all the missing children were at stake. Callahan, who had always had a pragmatic view of what was right or wrong, began to understand that his mission was now much greater than solving a simple disappearance case. It was a fight against forces that transcended any human logic. He who had lost his own family and sunk into the pain of the past finally found himself forced to confront his greatest fear, the powerlessness in the face of an evil he could neither understand nor defeat. But something inside him, a flame of survival, began to ignite. Looking at Lizzie, who was now beside him, he realized there was hope. It wasn't just about solving a case. It was about rescuing lost humanity, about preventing an evil power from spreading throughout the world. He couldn't let the shadows dominate the city again, as they had done so many decades ago. Lizzie, for her part, had learned more than she ever imagined about the cult and about herself. Initially, she was simply searching for the truth, a curious and skeptical reporter who found herself drawn into something much bigger. But what she found in the underworld was not just a horror story, but a journey of self-discovery. Each revelation made her grow, and she understood that the knowledge she now possessed might be the only thing capable of defeating the evil that haunted the city. Her sharp mind and unwavering courage began to mold her into a leader, someone who wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice everything to save others. With each obstacle that arose, Lizzie grew more determined to stop the cult from carrying out its apocalyptic ritual, but at the same time, she knew she needed Callahan. He represented the experience, instinct, and brute strength she needed to fight an enemy that was more than human. Together, they began to understand that to defeat Drayton and the Children of the Night, they needed to act strategically. They couldn't confront the cult directly with physical force, as the power they faced was far beyond anything the police or humans could control. They needed to discover the key to stopping the ritual Drayton was about to perform. The key lay in the children, in what they represented to the cult. They were not merely victims, they were the bridge between worlds. If the children were freed from their connection to the cult, the portals would close. But how to do this without sacrificing the children themselves? how to destroy the ritual without allowing the cult to gain enough strength to bring the horrors of the beyond into this world. The answer for Lizzie came in a moment of clarity. She remembered the inscriptions she had seen on the walls of Blackthorn Street, the marks made by the cultists. They were not merely symbols of worship, they were marks of an ancient protective spell. It was possible to reverse the ritual, but to do so, they needed a sacrifice of another kind, not the sacrifice of a life, but an act of courage and redemption. Lizzie and Callahan then began searching for the artifact that could help reverse the cult's magic. An old book, lost deep within the city, containing the original rituals used by the Children of the Night. The book, a forbidden relic, was kept in a secure location, protected by riddles and traps. They needed to find it before the cult used it to complete their apocalyptic ritual. During the search, Callahan confronted his own shadows. He had to face his loss, the pain that had paralyzed him for so long. He knew that to win, he would need to let go of the weight of the past and trust the people around him. Lizzie, a stranger at first, now became his fighting partner. Together, they could overcome any obstacle. Lizzie, for her part, found herself transformed by the trust Callahan placed in her. She never imagined she would face something so great. But now she knew that her courage came not only from her determination, but from the strength she found in others. The mutual support was shaping them into something stronger, something that could face even the oldest and deepest evil. They finally found the book, kept in an underground crypt, and began to study the rituals described within. Over time, they began to understand how to interrupt Drayton's ceremony, how to block the spell he was preparing. However, with each step, they knew that time was against them. The ritual was almost complete, and the force of shadows was rapidly approaching. Callahan and Lizzie were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives, not only against Drayton, but against the very fear and darkness that was spreading through Chicago. They needed one last act of courage to break the cycle. Would this ultimate sacrifice be the only key to saving the city? Were they ready to pay the price of their journey so far? Do you think Callahan and Lizzie will be able to reverse the ritual before it's too late? What do you think they'll have to sacrifice to stop the cult from winning? Chicago was silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The streets were deserted, the lights were off, and the wind seemed to whisper forgotten secrets. Callahan and Lizzie had reached the crucial point of their mission. They knew that Drayton's ritual was about to be completed, and that if they couldn't stop it, the world as they knew it would be irrevocably altered. The city was about to be swallowed by darkness, and only an act of courage could prevent it. The two were in an underground hideout, a safe place far from the eyes of the cult. The book lay open before them, and reading its forbidden pages had revealed a tortuous path to interrupt the ritual. But it wasn't simple. Drayton's spell was intertwined with the very essence of the cult, and any mistake could not only fail to interrupt the ritual, but also unleash the dark power he had summoned. While Lizzie studied the book, her eyes fixed on the words that seemed to dance before her, Callahan stood at the door, guarding the entrance. The air was thick, heavy with tension. He knew they didn't have much time. The cult had already begun the final stage of the ritual, and however much he tried to ignore it, fear seeped into his heart. It wasn't just the fear of failure, but the fear of what would happen if Drayton managed to complete the ceremony. If the children, the portals, and the beyond were unleashed, nothing could stop them. Lizzie looked up from her book and gazed at Callahan. They were united, not only by their mission, but by something deeper that made them strong. "We're almost there," she said, her voice firm yet heavy with weariness. She knew time was running out. The words in the book were clear. The key to breaking the spell was the connection between the cult leader and the children. Without Drayton, the ritual could not be completed. But for Drayton to be defeated, they would need the final artifact. An artifact he was guarding in his hideout, the Black Stone. The Black Stone was an ancient relic, an artifact that, when activated, had the power to block connections between worlds and seal the portals back to the afterlife. But the artifact was in a hard-to-reach place, the old cathedral in the heart of Chicago, now overrun by the cult. It was there that the ritual was about to conclude, and where Callahan and Lizzie would need to go. They had no time to lose. The city streets were slowly being overtaken by a menacing presence, something heavy and malevolent. The shadows seemed to move on their own, the icy winds carried echoes of distant voices, and the buildings themselves seemed to bend, enclosing the city in a deadly embrace. The city was being consumed by darkness, and ordinary people didn't even know what was about to happen. "We need to go now," Callahan said, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the weight of doubt. He knew the cathedral would be a fortress. The cult's power there was immense, and the final battle would not only be against Drayton's followers, but against the very evil that rose before them. Lizzie picked up her weapon, a simple revolver that now seemed ridiculously ineffective against the forces they were about to face. But what they had wasn't just physical strength. They had courage, determination, and the knowledge of what needed to be done. They weren't just fighting for their own lives, but for all the lives that were at stake. They were fighting for the future of Chicago. "Let's do this, together," Lizzie said with a tense smile that exuded a confidence Callahan needed. He nodded, sensing that the real fight was about to begin. They were ready to face the greatest fear of their lives. As they emerged from their hiding place, the city's atmosphere enveloped them, as if the very air were aware of their mission. They needed to reach the cathedral before Drayton finished the ritual. But with each step they took toward the cathedral, the darkness seemed to grow, as if something were watching them. When they reached the cathedral entrance, the presence of the cult was almost palpable. There was a thin line between reality and the other dimension, and the cathedral was the point of intersection. The portals were beginning to open, and shadows began to materialize within the church walls. Callahan and Lizzie were on edge. They knew that if they failed now, there would be no turning back. Inside the cathedral, at the altar, stood Drayton with the Black Stone in his hands. He was preparing the final spell, his eyes gleaming with the power he had summoned. He looked at them, a devilish grin spreading across his lips. "Do you think you can stop the inevitable?" Drayton said, his voice echoing through the empty cathedral. "What lies behind this curtain of shadows cannot be stopped. They will come, and Chicago will be the starting point of a new world." With a swift gesture, Drayton lifted the Black Stone, and a wave of dark energy spread through the cathedral as if the earth beneath them trembled. The portal doors began to open, and time seemed to freeze. But at the last moment, before he could finish the spell, Lizzie and Callahan launched themselves into the final battle. "Do you think Callahan and Lizzie will be able to interrupt the spell before Drayton completes the ritual? How do you think the final battle will unfold?" The cathedral was alive with a pulsating energy, as if the building itself were a creature thirsting for power. The portal doors, which had previously been only ajar, were now expanding, their openings widening like immense mouths devouring the light. The air was thick with a strange dampness, and the sounds were low, almost as if the space itself were breathing. Callahan and Lizzie stood before Drayton, the cult leader, who held the Black Stone in trembling but powerful hands. Time seemed to have slowed down. Shadows danced on the cathedral walls, and every movement Callahan and Lizzie made was accompanied by an overwhelming pressure, as if the whole world were waiting to see what would happen next. Drayton looked at the two of them, and a cold smile appeared on his face. "Do you think you can stop the inevitable?" Drayton laughed in a deep, menacing voice. "The ritual is complete. What is about to happen cannot be stopped. The forces we have invoked are greater than anything you can comprehend. The beyond is here, and you are merely in its path." But Callahan, his eyes fixed on the Black Stone, knew the battle wouldn't be won with words. Lizzie, revolver in hand, stood beside him ready to act. What Drayton didn't know was that their true strength lay not in physical weapons or knowledge of the ritual, but in the strength they had forged between themselves and in the people they were trying to save. They weren't fighting alone. "You're mistaken, Drayton," Callahan said, his voice deep but firm. "True strength doesn't come from your shadows, but from resisting the darkness, and we won't stop until we prevent that from happening." As Callahan spoke, Lizzie moved swiftly, trying to get closer to Drayton. But the black stone seemed to emit an energy field, repelling any movement in its direction. With each step she took, the air pressure increased, making it harder to breathe. Drayton lifted the stone with supernatural strength, and the portals around the cathedral began to open even wider, releasing a frigid, fierce wind that extinguished the candles around the altar. The cathedral began to tremble. It was as if the very foundation of the building was being corroded by the force Drayton was invoking. He seemed unperturbed, completely absorbed by the power of the black stone. His eyes were illuminated with an evil light, as if he himself were an extension of the evil that was about to take over the world. But Lizzie, without hesitation, fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the cathedral, but the bullet was deflected by the force of the energy surrounding Drayton. However, the shot served as a distraction. Callahan, in a swift movement, leaped toward Drayton, determined to eliminate him once and for all. He knew he didn't have much time. Drayton, focused on the stone's energy, didn't notice Callahan's attack until it was too late. With a swift strike, Callahan disarmed Drayton, snatching the black stone from his hands. The pulsating energy emanating from the stone now dissipated, but not before releasing a shockwave that made the cathedral tremble violently. The portal doors began to close, but the force was so intense that it seemed as if the universe itself was trying to open a rift between worlds. "It's no use!" Drayton shouted, his eyes wide with fury. "You can't stop what's already begun. The darkness will consume everything." But Callahan and Lizzie didn't hesitate. Together, with a strength that seemed to transcend fear, they moved forward. Callahan held the stone, focusing on what he needed to do. The book Lizzie had found taught them that, to seal the portals, they would need to perform an ancient spell, a spell that required courage, sacrifice, and above all, unity. "Let's do this," said Lizzie, placing her hand on Callahan's. They began reciting the words of the spell, and as the ancient words left their lips, an unexpected energy began to envelop the surroundings. The shadows that had previously seemed to have a life of their own began to dissipate. Drayton, now completely driven mad, tried to resist, but the black stone was becoming opaque, its dark energy fading away. The spell was working, but the cost was high. Callahan felt his strength draining away, as if life itself were being drained from him. Lizzie, beside him, also felt the weight of the spell, but knew there was no other option. They needed to win, or they would all be consumed by darkness. Finally, with a last cry of despair, Drayton tried to use the stone to attack, but the spell that Callahan and Lizzie had cast trapped him, paralyzing him in the center of the cathedral. The dark energy he had summoned was sealed, and the portals began to close with a deafening bang, leaving the city in absolute silence. The cathedral lights went out, and everything around them seemed to pause. Callahan and Lizzie fell to the ground, exhausted but alive. The weight of the battle finally seemed to have vanished, but the cost was clear. They had won, but in a way they might never fully comprehend. Do you think Callahan and Lizzie have definitively stopped the darkness, or is there something else yet to come? What do you expect for their future after their victory over the cult? The cathedral was silent. The energy that had filled the space with insane power was now slowly dissipating, leaving the air light and fresh, as if the city itself had breathed a sigh of relief. Callahan and Lizzie, on their knees on the floor, exhausted, felt the effects of the spell they had cast, a force that had consumed far more than their bodies, yet they had still managed to stop the apocalyptic ritual. Drayton's cult, with its supernatural forces, was now defeated. The altar, once covered in symbols of darkness, was empty. The black stone, the source of so much power, was now cold and lifeless, leaving only the echo of its malevolent presence. Drayton, who once stood as the leader of a revolution from the shadows, now lay fallen, his body motionless, lifeless, as if the very essence of the evil he had tried to summon had consumed him. He was no longer a threat. Lizzie looked around, feeling the weight of victory slowly settle on her shoulders. The city was still shrouded in a tense stillness, but the sense of urgency was gone, as if reality might tear apart at any moment. She glanced at Callahan, who sat beside her, breathing heavily, but with a determined expression. "We did it," she said, her words a whisper laden with exhaustion and relief. "But did we really do it? Do you think everything is resolved?" Callahan looked up at her, his face scarred from the fight, but now with a genuine smile. "We don't know yet, but the evil has been stopped, and the city is safe. We did it." But there was a shadow of doubt in their eyes. They knew that, however defeated the cult of Drayton had been, whatever they had summoned would still leave its mark. The battle was not merely physical, but spiritual. The city, though safe for the time being, had been touched by something that could not be so easily erased. Lizzie stood slowly, observing the empty altar. "The city will recover, Callahan. People will continue with their lives, but for us, everything has changed. There's no going back." Callahan nodded, standing beside her. "Yes, the darkness we saw here changed us in ways we can't fully comprehend. But for now, the important thing is that the children were saved, the cult was broken, and the city is free from the threat." The Chicago police, who had been informed about the disappearance of several children, arrived shortly afterward, their faces grim. When they entered the cathedral and saw the remains of the cult and the bodies of Drayton's followers, the sight was almost surreal. All that remained of the battle was a city that was somehow liberated. "Do you think people will believe what happened here?" Lizzie asked with a hint of melancholy. "Some will, others won't. Perhaps they'll never know the true extent of what almost happened here," Callahan replied, gazing at the distant horizon, where city lights shimmered under a clear sky. "But in the end, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we did the right thing, and at least for now, the city is saved." As they walked toward the cathedral's exit, a sense of completion enveloped them. They had faced evil, the impossible, and emerged victorious. But at the same time, they knew the fight would never truly end. The world was vast, full of mysteries and forces that could not be controlled. Evil, though defeated for now, would always find a way to return. But Callahan and Lizzie were now ready to face it again, if necessary. The darkness was sealed away, but the light that remained would be their weapon. Courage, determination, and the strength of a bond that could not be broken. Do you think the city will truly be safe now? What do you think will happen to Callahan and Lizzie after this battle? Will they be able to move on, or will the past haunt them? Months have passed since the final confrontation at the cathedral. Chicago, seemingly, has returned to normal. The streets are bustling, citizens are oblivious to what really happened, but some, especially the families of the missing children, knew that something sinister had been dismantled. Callahan and Lizzie, now closer than ever, continued their lives, but the weight of what they had experienced never faded. Every night, gazing at the starry sky, Callahan wondered if the shadows they had faced would ever truly recede. Lizzie, for her part, was ready to move on, but in her heart she knew that the stories of Chicago were far from over. What do you think the future holds for Callahan and Lizzie? Will they be able to leave the past behind, or will the darkness always return to haunt them? Callahan and Lizzie's story has ended, but the battle against darkness is never truly won. What do you think will happen next? Will the city of Chicago be safe, or will the shadows always return? Leave your thoughts in the comments. How do you imagine the protagonists will deal with the scars of battle, and what does the future hold for them? If you enjoyed this journey, share it with your friends and tell us what you liked most about the story. Don't miss out, because the shadows are still lurking and the next story may already be upon us.